He fired her when she told him she was pregnant. 20 years later, she walked into his office as his boss. Elliot Voss stood at the glass wall of his corner office and watched the city move at his feet. Below, taxis shuffled like chess pieces. Across the river, cranes lifted new towers that would, in a few months, carry his name on a brass plaque. He had a deal to close, a speech to rehearse, a gala to attend that night where his portrait would hang in the new wing of the Arts Center. Everything around him was lacquered. Polished oak desks, chrome accents, the exact right aroma of citrus in a diffuser. The world he had built hummed with certainty, the kind that lives on contracts, not apologies. Somewhere in another time, in a kitchen that never quite warmed, a woman had wrapped her hand around a brass key and pressed it until the metal bit into the smoothness of her palm. That key had opened a small drawer in a battered dresser, where she hid receipts, a faded photograph and a child's drawing of a house with too many windows. 20 years ago, under a rain-slicked sky and outside a building that smelled of lemon oil and fresh-pressed linen, she had been given an envelope and a brusque line. "We can't have this happen here." You can picture it. The rain worse than the words. The key colder than the hand that held it. The sudden public smallness of someone forced out of a life she had trusted. That memory would later be polished and framed in the mind of the woman who once scrubbed marble and pressed shirts. The woman who, less than 2 decades after that dismissal, would bring a team of lawyers to the very boardroom Elliot Voss used as a mirror. Her name was Ana Morales. She had not been hired for her credentials. She had been hired because she smelled of reliability, because she arrived early and left late, because she could make a house feel like it might hold a family, if only a family had chosen to stay. In the Voss household, she learned to fold napkins in perfect quarters, to iron collars so they shone without a crease, to arrange orchids so they seemed to bloom forever. She overheard conversations she was not meant to hear. She learned to move silently. In the evenings, she would sit on the last step of her tiny room above a laundromat and listen to the city and try to imagine a life with different light. The night she told Elliot she was pregnant, she had practiced the words in the mirror until they felt like thin glass. The pregnancy was not a scandal. It was a truth Ana had no desire to hide. She had hoped, absurdly, that honesty might be rewarded. Instead, reputation moved faster than compassion. The family's lawyer arrived first with an envelope that smelled faintly of grapes and ink. His voice was calm in the way knives are calm. "We'll make sure you're taken care of," he said. "There are arrangements." Ana thought of the child, of a small body she had already imagined and named. She put the brass key into her pocket. She refused to make a scene. She walked out with her bag of folded sheets and a small twinge behind her ear that would later feel like the moment her life pivoted. Outside, the rain came in steady threads. A car blocked the curb. A man, smooth in a dark coat, offered a terse nod and a folded bill slipped somewhere inside a newspaper. The Voss family, through the lawyer and a secretary who knew which phrases to use, said the word unfortunate and confidential and for everyone's good, until Anna's head buzzed with that spare corporate grammar. They had the power to make her invisible. Power, she would learn, loves the sound of its own voice. You might assume that's where the story ends, that this is the tragic footnote to a woman's life, a dismissal, a closed door, years of quiet suffering. But Ana was not a footnote. She was a quiet engine. After they pushed her out, she slept on another woman's couch for a few nights, then in a room above a bakery where the early light smelled of yeast and possibility. She learned to find work that could be done in the dark, early cleanings, late-night shifts, anything that kept her hands steady and her child fed. She learned accounting by watching, then by asking, then by borrowing textbooks she could not yet afford to own. She took night classes at a community college, and when funds were short, she worked longer hours, saved every extra dollar, and refused to let pity define her life. Her son, Diego, grew lean and clever, with the same dark eyes as the man whose face had once been framed on glossy magazine covers. Diego asked questions Ana could not always answer. He wanted to know why they had left, why they started again in a smaller apartment, why the lullaby changed when guests were expected. Ana told him less than the truth. She taught him instead how to tie a secure knot, how to hold his head high, how to count margins and margins again. She taught him to read financial statements before he learned multiplication tables. When he scraped a knee, she did not promise the world. She explained how to clean something properly. Diego grew into someone who could read into silence and saw opportunity where others saw only brick. But transformation is not a single thunderclap. It is many small acts stacked until they become unignorable. Anna started with a laundry route she won through tireless work. She negotiated with an owner to buy a small washing machine on credit. She took in curtains and office linens and learned the numbers behind stains. One night she stayed late sorting the linens of a boutique inn and found an invoice with a company's name and a number, an account that paid on time. She called, cultivated trust, and closed her first commercial client the way one might coax a seed through soil. Day by day the work grew. She took out a microloan to buy a dented van. Diego learned to fold shirts in quarter-size stacks. The brass key, sharp, ordinary, was kept in a tin with a child's drawing of a house, and when time allowed, Anna would press the drawing into her pocket and keep the quiet memory of rain close to her skin. Years of good, patient work are not glamorous, and the camera of fate rarely points there. But good, patient work is where companies begin. In a van with a dent, in a ledger that learns to balance, in an extra hour spent negotiating a cleaner contract that becomes a month's profit. Anna's name became read in invoices, then in checks. She hired one assistant. When a small textile mill on the outskirts of the city auctioned equipment that had been mothballed, she scraped together funds with a community of other women she had met while cleaning office buildings. They pooled capital, her credit, and months of sweat. She bought a single loom. The first cloth they made was nothing to write in glossy magazines. It was a heavy, honest weave that sold to a local upholsterer. That upholstery job paid for another bolt. A client who appreciated quality told a friend. In 5 years, Anna had a modest operation. A workshop that repaired textiles, supplied linens, and, controversially for an industry that loved the flash of novelty, committed to durability. Her brand, Hearthline, carried a small logo, a house with too many windows, drawn inefficiently but fondly by Diego when he was 8. The logo stuck. As Hearthline grew, Anna learned how to translate care into numbers. She taught herself corporate language as a survival tactic. She sat in on meetings with her accountant and repeated terms until they felt like tools: EBITDA, margins, capital expenditure. In her spare time, she read biographies of people who had changed the scale of industry by refusing to accept the accepted way. She filled notebooks with strategies and, sometimes, with lists of names she would one day hope to avoid. Elliot Voss did not notice Hearthline at first. The scale was not threatening. His interests lay in skyscrapers and credit lines that ran into many zeros, in galleries that put his name on plaques, in mergers that required tuxedos and curated toasts. But the financial world has a way of shrinking blind spots. An economic downturn hit an industry Elliot had a stake in. A development stalled. A tenant defaulted. His empire, enormous and well-insured, contracted in places where people had assumed it would expand forever. That is the moment when a small company with a loyal client base and iron discipline, where every dollar had been fought for and accounted for, starts to look like a lifeline. A property slated for a luxury conversion, standing half-finished by the river, needed management. A contract to supply the development with durable textiles and furnishings found its way into procurement's inbox. Hearthline prepared a bid. It was not their first, but it was the first that mattered. Meanwhile, the Voss household had its own internal rhythms of preservation. Reputation, Elliot had learned, can be managed. There were carefully chosen charities where one's presence was noticed, tight lists of friends to call when the cameras arrived, and family members who handled the messy edges. Vivian Voss, Elliot's sister, the kind who could make the phone book sound like danger, kept a ledger of slights in a way that was a kind of devotion. When Anna was dismissed, it was Vivian who had called the lawyer. Not because she bore personal animus, she had, in truth, never noticed Anna beyond the fact that the linens were always crisp, but because she had a ladder made of glass, and she climbed it as if it were the only thing that mattered. For Vivian, small reputations mattered because they accumulated into a greater one. Voss. Hurting perception was, for her, a vocation. Anna's transformation years later brought her to the point where she learned to read the subtlety of that kind of power. She read documents that told of discrete payments, line-itemed as consulting, that in retrospect were not consulting at all. She saw a juvenile pattern in how silence had been bought and sold in different neighborhoods. It was not that she obsessively hunted Elliot. She simply paid attention. Paying attention is how truth arrives in the shape of evidence. Diego, tall now, with those eyes that made strangers stop and remember someone else, sat in the workshop late, threading a loom with a precision he had acquired like a language. He had not been told where he came from in all detail. Anna kept things necessary and protective. He knew enough to ask the right questions. Who had given them money when they were starting? Why a man's photograph had been sometimes left on the table at odd times. He suspected things. He loved his mother. He grew into the person who would help her when things finally demanded more than a ledger and a stubborn heart. An ally came in the form of Samuel Ortiz, a retired contractor who had once worked for the Vosses. Samuel was not heroic in the cinematic sense. He was a man with a bent back and a conscience that had trouble holding secrets comfortably. He owed Anna for reasons no ledger could show, a small kindness she had once shown his niece, a favor refused by others. He began to speak, slowly, to the cracks in his memory. Little stories that, when threaded together, could outline a larger lie. But evidence cannot be merely anecdote. Anna knew that. She also knew the public would not care for sentiment as much as for a line of numbers and a stain of ink on paper. So over months, she cultivated records. She hired a discreet investigator, someone named Priya who had a talent for legal forensics and a way of making bank statements sing. Priya found an odd sequence of transfers years earlier, small at first, then larger, with descriptions that did not match services rendered. There were payments labeled to a shell company with an address that traced to a suburban mailbox. There were phone records that matched a lawyer's direct line at the exact hour someone had been persuaded to leave and keep quiet. The more Anna found, the more the narrative of the past rearranged itself into an outline that was no longer marginal. Bank statements became sentences. Emails with their timestamps and subject lines looked less like private notes and more like choreography. Who said what and when, how someone had been offered silence instead of empathy. Each piece did not exist alone. Together they began to tell the story of how a household had protected itself at the expense of a person whose only failing had been to be human. Anna's rise was not just financial, it was strategic. She made alliances with small investors who had little to lose and an appetite for firm returns. She made friends with suppliers who had the kind of documents that, in their archives, revealed a pattern of favors returned and jobs quietly shipped. She hired a young attorney, Rachel, whose education had been impeccable and whose outrage at injustice was a tool as sharp as any briefcase. Rachel taught Anna how to frame evidence, how to file petitions that had legal teeth, how to place a piece of paper in a judge's hands so the law would notice. There was no overnight accumulation of wealth. There was the patient accumulation of worth, a workshop that became a mill that became a supplier to boutique hotels, a supplier who learned how to bid on contracts bigger than anyone expected. Hearthline's margins grew, and with capital came leverage. When the stalled riverfront project, one of the properties Elliot had bankrolled with private equity and promises, reopened for bids after a pause, Anna's company did what small, smart companies do. It bid precisely, with a guarantee, with a history of delivery. Their proposal was clean, reliable, and when the committee convened, the people who had been slowly losing faith in glitzy promises but not in results leaned toward Hearthline. Elliot noticed then, not because of a personal vendetta, but because business has a way of making enemies where there were only unknowns. His procurement director, a man more accustomed to large, faceless contractors, scrunched his face at the Hearthline proposal. "They're too small," he said. "We need backup, we need scale." He typed an email to his executive team that read, carefully, like a question poised as a command. Vivian called Elliot and told him, under the sound of a fine dinner being arranged, that small companies were a risk. "We don't want direction to change," she said. "A man's name can become muddled if we have the wrong partners." Anna saw in the bidding for the riverfront property not only an opportunity for profit, but a way to be visible where she had once been invisible. Visibility could be dangerous, but it could also be justice. The riverfront would hire contractors, decorators, suppliers. If Hearthline won, Anna would have a place in the construction of something that bore his name indirectly, through the chain of suppliers, through invoices and oversight. Her goal was not revenge as spectacle. It was to assert presence and capability, where once she had been erased. At the same time, Samuel Ortiz found a ledger in a storage unit he had been paid to clear out years earlier. He shoved the manila folder under Anna's door one rainy afternoon. Rain again, as if memory kept returning to that weather, and watched as Anna untied the twine and rifled through the stained pages. There were names, numbers, notes about an arrangement with blank initials. There was also, tucked in the back, a photograph with the edges browned. A small woman with almond eyes, fingers pressed around a baby, and in the background a man with the profile of a skyline, recognizable in the way that public men become recognizable. This photograph was a small thing. It was the kind of thing that could be dismissed. But Anna kept it because sometimes the smallest objects anchor truth in ways a ledger cannot. The brass key went into her palm as she looked at the image. The child in the picture looked like Diego in a way that made Anna both breathe and hold her breath. Everything she had built, education, grit, witnesses, documentation, had a purpose beyond money. She protected her son by building a life strong enough to withstand exposure. She recalled countless nights when she had not eaten to be sure Diego had something warm the next day. She had sunk every small triumph into creating a network that could not be easily toppled by a press release or a hush-money envelope. Power, she had learned, was a thing that multiplied when it was shared. She offered her partners transparent contracts and a promise of dignity. And yet the past does not dissolve simply because the present is sturdy. It hums beneath like an old electricity. While Anna fortified Hearthline, Elliot and his circle moved in a rhythm that presumed silence. They did not think small people would matter. Power is not always clever. Sometimes it is simply complacent. That complacency is an opening. Anna did not plan a dramatic entrance into Elliot's life. She planned for a boardroom in which information would be undeniable. She worked with Rachel to assemble a dossier that would not be dismissed as personal grudge. Bank transfers mapped to shell companies. Emails that mentioned payments under the unhelpful rubric of consulting. Samuel's recollection of who was present when offers were made. They spoke to a former procurement manager from Elliot's company who had left under regret, and who, in a coffee shop with a trembling hand, admitted that the practice of paying to avoid scandal had been in use for years. He handed over a thumb drive of emails he had kept, perhaps out of some stubborn loyalty to truth. You can imagine the montage. Anna, in her office at midnight, lamplight on her face, files spread like the wings of a plan. She would place the small photograph next to a bank statement and feel, for a second, like the world aligned. She did not gloat. She catalogued. She prepared. But notice this. Anna did not wish to ruin people for the sake of ruin. She wanted accountability, a public recognition that a life had been damaged by a choice made to preserve an image. She wanted a place at the table of power, and quietly, a safer life for Diego. She wanted the right to be seen as a person whose past mattered, and whose future would no longer be determined by the gentleness of someone else's apology. Inside Elliot's life, there was another drama of a different sort. He had spent 2 decades believing that authority could stand apart from remorse. Publicly, he was cordial, philanthropic, habitual in his gestures. Privately, he had rooms where photographs of a younger self sat next to expensive glass trophies. He had played the part of someone who deserved success because he had labored for it, but had also let others do the dirty work that protected his image. There were nights, rare and thin, when he would wake from a hotel room and feel, like a sudden pulse, a loneliness that his successes could not fill. He could not name it to himself. Money bought experiences, but not the kind of memory that requires naming. He would always be stand-in for a household that valued appearance, never for a life that required making real amends. When Hearthline's bid came in for the riverfront contract, Elliot's inner counsel went to work. It was not only a procurement decision, it was a social one. If Hearthline succeeded, the narrative might shift. If Hearthline failed, Elliot could shrug and call it poor timing. But the world of business is a braided thing where reputation, profit, and the quiet memory of past actions can meet. The first block of this story ends, as real stories do, with an ask: will people listen? Will the evidence seem sensible, clean, enough to persuade a committee whose job is to preserve capital first and conscience second? Anna pushed forward a file that smelled faintly of dust and lemon, something like the smell of the past pressed into the present, and waited. If this kind of twist speaks to you, if you crave stories where the downtrodden learn to make power their own, like and subscribe. Stay for the way evidence rearranges lives, for the way small objects become anchors, for the slow accretion of courage into a plan. The days that followed were a flurry of formalities. Hearthline prepared presentations, polished invoices, arranged references from hotels that had loved their service for years. Anna practiced answering questions she knew a procurement board would ask. Where is your capital? Who are your suppliers? Can you deliver at scale? She had rehearsed these answers over 10 years of making promises to customers and keeping them. Elliot's team, for their part, assembled counter-arguments. Vivian's letters became gentle urgings, the kind that sounded like preservation. We need to ensure continuity, she wrote. We cannot allow impressionable stakeholders to be misled by emotion. Elliot read the memo and felt that small, familiar itch of self-preservation that has no conscience but many reflexes. In the middle of these machinations, Anna received a call from Samuel. There's one more thing, he said, voice creaking like a door. He had been watching an auction of old corporate files that, for reasons he could not fully explain, someone had left unindexed and unloved. It was as if the past itself had been misfiled and left to rot in boxes. Samuel, who had always kept an eye for a stray truth, found among those boxes a contractor's ledger that bore a mark, an ink blot and a set of initials that matched a lawyer who had once visited the Voss house. That ledger was not a verdict. It was one more thread. But Anna had learned to make threads into rope. The ledger added clarity to Priya's mapping of transactions. The photograph, the ledger, the depositor names. They each had their own weight. She worked with Rachel to draft a letter of inquiry to the Riverfront Committee, a formality that would place the documents in the official record if needed, that would flag a potential conflict of interest in the procurement process. A formal query was a small, procedural thing, yet it had the advantage of being public in a way that private accusations are not. Diego watched his mother from the doorway, the adult son who had once been tucked under his mother's elbow while she ironed. He had learned to carry himself like a person who would not run when called to stand. He had not yet met Elliot Voss. He had grown up with photographs of a man he could have known but did not. He had never been angry in the way the world thought might explain his mother's life. He had a more nuanced emotion, an impatience for truth. The first legal step was simply to get Hearthline's bid noticed, without being dismissed as the scrappy upstart with sentimentality. The team prepared a smooth presentation, cost analysis, delivery timeline, references, and an exhibit folder that, should the committee ask for more, could hold the ledger pages and the account trails in a way that would not seem like malice but like due diligence. Anna's plan was to win the contract, secure a foothold that could not be trivialized, and, under the cover of legitimate business dealings, to weave the strands of evidence into something that could no longer be swept under a carpet. When the procurement meeting convened, it was not the boardroom of Elliot's skyscraper. It was a municipal committee that had a bland table and fluorescent lights. Vendors came and went like a marketplace. Anna sat in the back, her hands folded on her lap. She wore a simple suit, navy, not flashy, and the brass key was stitched into the inside pocket of her jacket. It was a private talisman. The committee chairman, an efficient man who had seen many bids, looked at Hearthline's proposal and raised an eyebrow. "You're small," he observed. He was not unkind. He saw markets in columns and liked people who fit expected boxes. But as the numbers were explained and the references called, something shifted. The Riverfront Committee, used to receiving glossy presentations from grand contractors, found itself impressed by Hearthline's detail. The guarantee was tight, the supply chain clear. The chairman's expression, hesitant at first, softened into the professional curiosity that happens when skill meets need. Across town, Elliot received the news with a controlled interest. He could have called a favor, made a quiet call to derail a small company the way one clears a garden of weeds. That option was on the table. He could have called the procurement director and whispered. But something in him, an old, half-formed conscience or simply a fatigue with orchestrated silence, paused. There was a line you did not cross, he had been told since boyhood, not because the line was moral, but because reputation lived on the safe side of it. He had crossed that line in the past when he had to. The Voss machine had done what machines do: apply lubricant where friction might expose weakness. On the morning the committee announced an interim decision, Anna was at the workshop, hands covered in dye. Diego came in with a box of freshly folded swaths. He looked at his mother and placed one small drawing on her desk, the old house with too many windows, now framed and colored. "For luck," he said. Anna smiled, the way people do when they take luck and make it a practice. The committee had not yet decided final contracts, but Hearthline had been singled as a finalist. In the paperwork that followed came a standard clause: bidders must disclose any conflicts of interest within a certain period. Anna looked at the clause and felt the thin air of possibility. A conflict of interest disclosure could be a regulatory tool. It could open the door to asking questions that led to records. It was, practically speaking, an invitation to bring papers into daylight. She passed the clause to Rachel and to Priya. "We'll be careful," Rachel said. "We won't weaponize the past. We'll place the facts where they belong." And that is how a small company, grown by hands that remembered both starch and scarcity, took its seat facing a man who had once dismissed them. Anna did not imagine Elliot falling to his knees in apology. She imagined instead a world in which truth did not have to rely on the memory of rain and the resilience of one woman. She imagined a boardroom where a ledger spoke louder than a lie. She imagined her son never again having to hide a drawing for fear of it being inconvenient. But the machinery of status does not surrender easily. Vivienne's friends began to murmur. Elliot's PR team drafted a bland memo about corporate governance. An anonymous note, always the favorite tool of influential people, was sent to a journalist hinting that Anna's application was driven by personal vendetta, that a small family business had overreached. The attempt to smear hinged on the hope that people prefer neat narratives: ambitious woman, revenge motive, neither of which are as compelling as the slow work of truth. Just when momentum seemed to tilt toward a legitimate business victory, Anna received a message that made her stop knitting together the next steps. The file Samuel had found contained in its back pages a receipt that mapped, in a way no one could simply dismiss, to a payment 20 years ago. It bore a timestamp. It bore the same handwriting as a note she had once seen tucked behind a ledger in the Voss house. It bore the initials VG, the initials of a lawyer who had been the family's fix. Anna looked at the receipt and felt a familiar cold press against her chest. History, at last, had texture. She knew, then, that she held something that could not be ignored, a concrete paper trail, faint but legible. She called Diego into the office. "I need you to watch this," she told him, "because if this is what I think, we will need to be ready." Diego sat beside her and read. He was 20 now, a man who could chase down a supplier and negotiate credits, a man who had learned to translate the language of scarcity into possibility. He turned the receipt over in his fingers like it was something both dangerous and ordinary. "This could be it," he said. "This could be what we need to tie the ledger to them." Anna did not say the words revenge or triumph. She said quietly, "We will be just. We will not make monsters of men. We will ask for the truth." They had not yet decided how or when to bring the evidence forward. They had not yet called a press conference or filed a lawsuit. The riverfront bid hung in a limbo that could tilt either way, but the gears had begun to mesh. Procurement, evidence, and a small, smart company suddenly in a position to ask a question nobody else had had cause to pose. And so part of the story stopped, not because everything was resolved, but because the field had been set, and players were moving across it. Anna wore the brass key like an amulet. The photograph was clean in its frame. Hearthline prepared invoices and guarantees. Elliot polished his name on the building's brass. A ledger, a receipt, and a contractor's memory had become a narrows through which justice might pass. What happens next would depend on dozens of things. A committee's appetite for risk, the courage of a single contractor to testify on record, the stubbornness of a woman who had no time left to be small. It would depend on whether those who had once chosen silence could speak without the machine of reputation grinding them down. It would depend on whether Anna could harness the only weapon she trusted, evidence held to the light, without losing herself in the act of exposure. At the edge of this movement, Anna sat in her workshop and watched the city she had once watched for breathe under a noon sun. She had once believed in a world that rewarded hard work by default. She had learned that world is not fair. She had also learned that fairness can be engineered if you are patient and precise. Outside, the river moved on, indifferent and faithful. Inside, a woman who had been pushed out of a house by a family grown too fond of its image, prepared to walk into rooms that had once refused her. She did not go to humiliate. She went to be recognized. And somewhere, in a glass office filled with the smell of citrus, Elliot Voss checked his phone, glanced at a forwarded memo about a small company making waves, and felt, for the first time in a long while, the prickle of something he had not invited. Accountability. The committee's email arrived on a Tuesday, and carried the polite tension of a thing about to shift. Hearthline had been shortlisted as the lead supplier for the riverfront restoration. It was not a victory yet. Nothing about the world Anna had built happened in a single moment. But it was an invitation into rooms that had once been closed to her. The committee's notice asked for final disclosures, board references, and financial guarantees. It also made a routine demand. Bidders must disclose any conflicts of interest and any past legal entanglements related to parties on the project. Anna held the email in her hands the way one holds a small hot stone. She had spent a decade learning how to sit with pressure. Diego watched her from the doorway, and for a beat she allowed herself to see the boy who had once curled up under a blanket while she ironed. Then she folded the feeling away and did what she did best: line up facts, assign names, and make lists. The next 24 hours became a careful choreography. Priya refined the timeline of transfers, so it read like a map rather than a scavenger hunt. Rachel drafted a disclosure that was spare and precise, one that put entire exchanges into public record without the tone of grievance. Samuel delivered another envelope, this one a thin manila packet of receipts and an index of who had been paid and when. Each document was a small chisel. "You know what we're doing," Rachel said, pragmatic and blunt. "We're forcing daylight across a ledger that was never meant to see one." Anna nodded. "We're not here to punish blindly. We want the truth to be true in the same room the lie was told." You could feel the air change in the Voss orbit. Vivian registered Hearthline's bid as a nuisance. Elliot registered it as a variable to be controlled. He had always been someone for whom variables were anathema. Control, in his universe, was less about malevolence than habit. A series of small gestures, call the right friend, fund the right gala, make the right donation, that kept the machine well-oiled. Press rumors started as they often do. At first a whisper in a financial newsletter about unusual vendor activity, then an anonymous tip to a city reporter who sniffed for a larger story. The attempt to spin the narrative, small local supplier with sentimental ties, was a crude hope. The narrative that stuck, as narratives will, was the one that was easiest to sell, a woman with a personal grudge trying to upend a big project. Anna refused to hand them that script. She and Rachel placed the documents with a municipal clerk in a manner that made them part of the public record. They filed a formal inquiry that asked the Riverfront Committee to review possible conflicts of interest related to past donor payments and vendor selection. The city, which liked tidy procedures, could not ignore a formal request with supporting documents. A preliminary audit was opened. That, in bureaucratic terms, is like opening a window in a room full of dust. Once the air moves, you see what's settled on the sill. Then the most delicate thing happened. The human thing that no ledger can capture, but which often makes or breaks the legal arc. A former Voss procurement manager, Marco Rivera, who had left the company 5 years earlier under a cloud of professional regret, reached out to Anna. He had been suggested by Samuel, and when they finally sat in a dim coffee shop, Marco's hands trembled before his words did. "I kept a copy," he said, sliding a small thumb drive across the table as if it were contraband. His voice had the brittle quality of someone who had stored guilt like a fossil. "I wasn't sure I should, but there were nights I woke up and thought, maybe the ledger was wrong. Maybe I was wrong to look the other way." The thumb drive contained emails, terse chains where payments labeled consulting fees and one-time retainer were routed to an account that, when traced, fed into a shell corporation registered under a name that matched a mailbox used by the Voss household's fixer. There were notes with initials, and one email referenced, with corporate euphemism, relocation assistance. The chain of correspondence was not a confession. It was the next best thing, a pattern that required explanation. Priya's mapping tied those emails to bank records. The shell company's money trail ran like a narrow stream into an account that, in the years after Anna's dismissal, carried a string of deposits and one sizable withdrawal that coincided with a hospital invoice from the same month Anna had given birth. Not all the pieces screamed guilt at once, but together they made a picture that could not be ignored. When Anna and Rachel presented a compact, legally framed dossier to the Riverfront Committee, and to a small legal probe initiated by the city, the reaction was not the melodramatic gasp of a TV courtroom. It was steadier. Phone calls, requests for clarification, procedural subpoenas. The city solicited statements and the procurement committee delayed their final vote until the auditors reported. Elliot felt the prickle again, the one at the back of his neck he had felt when Hearthline first appeared as an anomaly. He called his public relations director and asked for a counter-strategy. Vivian called donors. A small amp of indignation clicked into place in the philanthropic circles they frequented. "This is about reputation," someone told him. "We will manage it." But reputation, once put under the microscope, travels down channels reputation can't control. Shareholders began quietly asking questions about projects that relied on goodwill rather than hard performance. Lenders who had once nodded through assumptions became more curious about contractual protections. A small audit by an independent investigator, required because the Riverfront project had a public funding component, produced a memo suggesting that the contractor selection process be paused until potential conflicts were resolved. Public pressure in these circles is often less about news headlines and more about the quiet math of risk. Investors began to call Elliot's office not with accusations but with queries. Can we isolate the risk? The hedge funds that liked to short a company when its governance was questioned sent polite inquiries. The financial world's polite inquiries carry teeth. They can make a board decide that saving face is more expensive than replacing an executive. That is the exact moment when the structural weakness of a reputation built on silence shows itself. The Voss empire had been lean in places, large decisions hedged on perception, and the assumption that perception could be managed. As auditors bent their heads over invoices and the Riverfront Committee stalled, lenders tightened covenants related to project completion. The design of many corporate empires is such that a single tremor in a big project can cause tremors elsewhere. Anna's team did not revel in the storm they had helped summon. They had, instead, lined up the things that might protect them from being accused of opportunism. They had done due diligence. They had given the committee the chance to investigate. They had created a public legal path by which the claims could be considered. Then came the one thing most people in power fear the most, a piece of paper with a signature on it. It arrived at Anna's office with the mechanical anonymity of courier paper, but the content could not be dismissed. The document was an old intake form from a private hospital that had been used by the Voss family's circle in the year Anna had left. The form contained a section where a father could acknowledge paternity at the time of birth. Someone, decades earlier, had checked a box and written a name. The writing was small and hurried, but the initials matched the lawyer's signature Anna had seen before in a folder Samuel had turned over. There was an accompanying payment stub showing the same shell company as the payer of an unexpected relocation fee. "No single document is a verdict," Rachel said when Anna showed her the form. "But this is the kind of paper that makes a judge look twice." Diego's hand found hers, the same hand that once drew a house with too many windows. He was 21 now and cautious in ways his mother had learned to be. "We can run a paternity test," he said softly. It was a moment that required ethical clarity. Anna could have tried to produce one without Elliot's consent, but that would have risked legal and moral complications. Instead, they prepared the paperwork for a civil petition, an action that would request paternity confirmation and potential reparations. They amassed the documents and jammed them into a legal strategy that aimed to make truth efficient. The petition sought a judicial order for a DNA test if necessary, an ordinary legal recourse when parentage is in question, not a clandestine act. When the petition was served, the city's legal wheels, slow but steady, began to turn. Elliot was notified. His counsel advised delay, the familiar tactic. He could have agreed to a test and ended speculation, but that would imply acceptance of paternity and legal responsibility. He instead instructed his lawyers to challenge the chain of custody of the hospital form. He issued a statement through his PR team that respected due process and promised cooperation with the city audit. The public saw a man who was polite and circumspect. The private world watched for the next procedural move. In court, the judge, sober, not interested in melodrama, reviewed the petition, the hospital intake, the ledgers, and the mapping of transfers. A judge's decision is seldom poetic, but it is decisive when paperwork aligns. Because the documents demonstrated a plausible basis for testing, and because Diego, as the party seeking recognition, consented to the process, the court ordered a paternity test. There are small cinematic moments even in bureaucratic procedures. The technicians at the clinic wrapped sterile swabs and explained the process with offhand empathy. Diego sat with his arm across the little exam table and laughed at an awkward joke the nurse told to ease tension. When Elliot's people arrived to provide a sample, the air in the clinic felt like the hush of a city before rain after a long drought. Elliot's hands, used to signing documents with confidence, trembled when he took the swab. The result, when it came a week later, was a private document with heavy public weight. The lab report was clear. A statistical probability of paternity that, in legal terms, is as close to certain as such things get. Diego and Anna were biologically father and son and half-brother of a family who had treated their existence like an inconvenience. How that truth rippled outward was not cinematic in the way television imagines. It was procedural and brutal. Lawyers on both sides wrote letters that felt like market moves. The Riverfront Committee, which had paused its decision, issued a statement acknowledging the audit and promising transparency. The city's press, hungry for consequence, reported the paternity finding as one part of a larger story about governance and moral responsibility. Investors called the Voss board. A few asked if they could talk about leadership stability. An internal review was proposed by the Voss board to evaluate governance practices. Power in corporate life has little margin for scandal. When governance is questioned and debt commitments loom, boards, actuated by insurance and fiduciary duty, act fast. Elliot's largest institutional backers, pension funds and a mid-sized investment consortium worried about risk exposure, suggested that the board consider interim measures. They were not a lynch mob. They were managing risk the way actuaries manage storms. The board convened in a room whose carpet had the steady authority of decades of decisions. Vivian sat poised, her face an art of calm. Elliot walked in with the gait of a man who had been to many meetings and believed he knew their scripts. He did not expect the tenor to change so quickly. The board's chair, an unglamorous man who loved regulation more than applause, brought them to order. He read a statement that was practiced and cold. Because of the recent disclosures and the potential legal exposure, the board recommended Elliot step aside as CEO, while an independent review could be completed. The word step aside is a gentle legalism. In corporate worlds, it often means a forced exit dressed as an interlude. Elliot took the news the only way he knew how, with a measure of brittle dignity and the slow calculus of a man considering his options. He called Vivian and his attorneys and made a defense that relied on nuance and denial. He also, a small boy again in the private dark of a hotel room, felt a loneliness that had depth now and accusation. Anna watched the news like a person watching weather cross a horizon. She had not pursued this to see a man fall. She had pursued it so a life could be recognized and her son could have a name that was not a rumor. She had not wished for Elliot's erasure. She had wished for the small justice of a ledger that could no longer be a fog. Yet the corporate world likes firm answers. The board's action created the financial space for a recapitalization plan. Investors suggested a restructuring, a new capital infusion, oversight on large projects, and a management team to guide the company through the next 12 months. The consortium that offered the capital included a mid-size private equity firm and several local investors who had slowly become part of Hearthline's circle because they respected the way Anna ran numbers and paid suppliers promptly. They had seen Hearthline's work on boutique hotels and had enjoyed a return on their small placement. They liked the notion of an operator who understood both margins and people. When the consortium offered to underwrite a portion of the immediate refinancing in exchange for seats on the board and an active management role, terms were drafted quickly. In those terms was language that would change the story's axis. The consortium asked for oversight in exchange for capital. Part of that oversight package included naming a representative who would be part of executive leadership during the transition. Anna's investors proposed her as the person to be that representative. There are moments when years of patient work conspire into a single administrative sentence. Subject to board approval, Anna Morales will assume the role of Executive Director of Supplier Relations under the restructuring plan. It read dry and procedural in the document, but in human terms it read like a reversal. Elliot, facing the grinding mechanisms of finance and governance he had always thought he controlled, found his options narrower than he'd assumed. To negotiate for retention of influence, he would have to promise compliance with the new oversight. His attorneys argued for a consultancy arrangement. His backers made quiet calls about reputational risk. The board, guided by fiduciary caution, approved the restructuring. It was a pragmatic vote, not a moral reckoning. But the outcome was the same. The man who had once dismissed Anna would now have to work under a management system that included her and answer to a board she had a seat at. The day Anna walked into Elliot's office, the city smelled of citrus and rain. An irony she did not fail to note. The office was, as always, immaculate. Glass walls, a desk that never seemed to collect dust, a chair that understood posture. But something in the room had shifted. The tension of it was no longer only his. There was a new presence. The subtle authority of someone who had learned to command by organizing facts and convening people who would stand for them. Elliot stood when she entered, a reflex. He offered a handshake that was polite but formal. Anna accepted it with a calm that could not be mistaken for triumph. She had learned how to be present without spectacle. "You have my office?" he asked, the question more rhetorical than curious. "My company has a seat on the management committee," she replied, even and unembellished. "As per the restructuring agreement, I'm here to introduce myself and to begin the handover of supplier oversight." He blinked, a small human fissure, as if the world had imprinted a detail he had not anticipated. "I suppose protocols require introductions," he said, trying on a dryness to mask dislocation. Anna set a slim folder on his desk. It contained the items that had mattered, a copy of the hospital intake form, the ledger evidence they had presented to the committee, a memo summarizing the legal steps they had taken to secure due process. It was not a threat. It was a ledger, the kind he had once preferred, numbers and dates whose beauty lay in how they resisted myth. "I'm not here to humiliate you," she said. "This job is about making sure the projects you started are finished with fewer corners cut. It's about ensuring the people who work for you are treated with a minimum of dignity. It's about making right where right was possible." Elliot watched her. There was a fragment of something like recognition in his face, followed by a guarded professional anger. "You understand how this looks," he said. "You're young. You know momentum matters." "You asked what the world looks like," Anna replied. "This is what it looks like when facts are visible. There are consequences to choices. That is not called vengeance. It is called accountability." He inhaled, and for a moment the man who wanted to control the narrative seemed to drift. Then the old reflex, defend, deflect, survive, took him. "We can make amends in private," he said. "We don't have to make a spectacle." "Private amends do not remove the obligation to the public record," Anna said. "But there are ways to repair without spectacle. The question is whether you will be part of a repair that is truthful." There is a long tradition of such conversations ending in one of two ways: a quick settlement that brushes history aside, or a slow public passage that removes someone from power if accountability is not seen. Elliot had a choice. He could accept the conditions of the restructuring, apologize publicly, and fund a trust for Diego's future and a grant for workers harmed by the practice of hush payments. Or he could fight, force discovery, and risk a drawn-out legal collapse that might cost him everything he had built. He thought of Vivian and of the board. He thought of the photographs on his walls and of the nights when loneliness felt like a remnant. He also thought of the ledger Elena, his lawyer, had once folded into an envelope, proof that had once seemed necessary to keep the machine humming. That machine was humming less smoothly now. When Elliot finally spoke, the tone was unexpectedly small. "If I agree, what does that look like?" he asked. Anna laid out terms that were practical. A public acknowledgement from him that certain payments had been made under his watch, and a pledge to fund a remediation program without admission of criminal intent, but with the promise of civil reparation. She demanded that the company institute governance reforms, an independent overseer of procurement, transparency about vendor selection, and a formal inclusion of supplier equity standards. She insisted on a fund established for workers whose livelihoods had been affected by hush payments, and she requested a place for Diego, a legitimate position that would allow him financial stability and career growth, not pity, Elliot considered. Pride is a domestic form of oxygen. Remove it and men sometimes flail. He had spent decades breathing an air of entitlement. To publicly concede would be to admit a fracture in the thing he used to cover fragility. He did not like the terms, but he saw the alternatives. The board, his backers, the auditors, none of them were interested in a drawn-out fight that bled the company of value. In the end, Elliot did not stand on the stage of a televised confession. He signed a memorandum of understanding in a quiet conference room, lawyers and a neutral mediator present. But the signature had weight. It was less a dramatic fall than a practical resignation. He agreed to step aside as CEO within 30 days and support the transition. The board accepted the terms. The restructuring moved forward. And for the first time in 2 decades, a former maid who had been pushed out of a household sat in the management suite of a company whose decisions would touch properties with his name on them. The timing of being made his superior was not a contrived coup. It was the aggregated weight of governance and investor appetite. Anna did not gloat. She understood the danger of letting power become vindictive. She had built Hearthline as a company that contracted with hotels and restorers, not as an instrument of revenge. Her leadership involved the practicalities of procurement cycles and the ethics of labor practices. Yet no one mistook the symbolism. The first time she walked into Elliot's office as the person who had authority over supplier decisions, the brass key in her jacket pocket felt like a relic and a talisman. The citrus diffuser still hummed in the corner, But Anna smelled other things too. The dust of audit reports, the faint iron of old money. Their interaction that morning was not a single showdown. It was a series of small, pragmatic conversations about timelines, vendor lists, and contractual clauses. But under every procedural sentence lay the personal, and the personal can tilt decisions in ways spreadsheets do not explain. Elliot, who had once pushed a woman into the rain to protect a reputation, now found himself in the position of having to learn how to be accountable in practical terms. Outside the glass, the city moved on. Vivian retained her composure in the public sphere but grew inwardly furious at what she called unnecessary theatrics. She attempted, through a channel or two, to negotiate for a more private arrangement. The investors declined. The narrative had changed. It was no longer only about a supplier who wanted a project. It was about governance and the moral risks of laundering silence with money. The story's most tender scene was not in the boardroom. It was in a small cafe, where Anna and Diego met Elliot for the first time outside legal filings. Diego had agreed to the meeting because he wanted to understand, not to perform. Elliot had not expected to feel the simple, human shock of seeing a son who carried his features like a photo carried weather. They sat across a table worn by countless small conversations. The sun turned the cafe's glass bright and forgiving. The moment of introduction was awkward by design. Legal counsel had advised restraint, so they kept to simple logistics, brief words, measured tones, a conversation that did not attempt to heal decades in one sitting. Diego spoke first with a precision that made his mother proud. "You have the right to know me," he said. "If you want to be part of a life now, that's something we'll consider. But I'm not a prop." Elliot listened. For a man who had always measured his worth in deals and events, this was a new kind of negotiation, the price of being human. He offered a guarded apology, the sort that tried to be both personal and juridical. "I am sorry," he said. "If my actions caused harm, I regret them. I want to make sure you have support." It was, in many ways, the exact kind of imperfect human response the world knew how to produce. Words offered with the hope that they would be enough. Diego watched him, then at his mother, and then he spoke in a way that surprised both of them. "I don't need you to fix everything," he said. "I need you to be honest, and to step up in ways that matter. If you are willing to do that, financially, truthfully, publicly, then we can talk about what you mean to us." Elliot swallowed. The conversation did not resolve everything. It resolved something, though. A hand reached for a hand, and a small truce of possibility formed. Diego would not accept a posed apology. He insisted on action. Elliot, confronted with the human cost of his choices, began to learn the currency of restitution, public acknowledgement, structural change, and long-term support. The legal aftermath in the weeks that followed had its own rhythms. The city completed its procurement review. The riverfront contract was awarded to Hearthline, with new oversight provisions and a clause for supplier equity. The Voss firm's board implemented governance reforms. The fund that Anna had negotiated, a small reparations and worker protection fund, was established with contributions from both the company and Elliot personally, a way of placing money where it could be deployed to protect workers subject to hush payments. Some people call these measures inadequate because no fund replaces dignity the way a single word might, but dignity is rebuilt through steady practices as much as through apologies. The fund created training programs, small grants for workers who had been pressured by hush payments, and a mediation panel for labor disputes that could no longer be resolved with envelopes. Vivian retreated into a smaller social circle and continued to insist, privately, that the company had been unfairly treated. Elliot, who had once believed his image could be preserved through careful arrangement, found himself learning a different kind of leadership, one where oversight mattered and where people's stories could not be minimized without cost. That lesson was difficult and expensive. It was, in many ways, the point. Anna returned to Hearthline and its rhythms. The workshop by the river became a place of production and planning. She framed Diego's drawing in her office and placed the brass key on a shelf where it could be seen but not idolized. The key was a reminder of how small objects carry memory. The drawing reminded her of what she had been fighting for. She also did something that was harder than any victory. She kept her compassion intact. In meetings where they discussed charges and supplier vetting, she pushed for standards that favored small operators who had been squeezed by the market, and for clauses that mandated fair labor practices. She knew that replacing one form of power with another that merely swapped names did nothing for justice. Power, she understood, multiplies when shared. The public reaction to the story split along predictable lines. Some applauded the procedural victory and the governance reforms. Others moaned that a wealthy man had escaped full accountability because of an elegantly negotiated exit. The truth is that few stories in corporate life end with perfect morality. They end with rearranged structures that either reduce harm or perpetuate it in polished forms. Anna's practical aim had been to reduce harm and secure a future for her son. She had achieved that with the help of allies who had learned to keep facts as weapons for good. 3 months after the restructuring, Anna found herself walking into Elliot's office again. This time it was not as a confrontation but as a check-in. The riverfront project was moving forward with Hearthline's supplies on schedule. Workers wore new contracts that spelled out protections. The fund was disbursing small grants. Elliot had taken a leave of absence and had publicly apologized in a restrained statement, having accepted a role focused on philanthropy and serving as a figurehead while an independent auditor monitored project compliance. He greeted Anna with a genuine small smile that seemed to have cost him something. "You've done well," he said. Anna could have been flattered. Instead, she spoke plainly. "We did what needed to be done. My hope is that when this is done, the people who built the city will be treated with a fraction of the dignity they deserve." Elliot nodded. "I can't undo the past," he murmured, "but I can try not to let it happen under my watch again." That sentence, imperfect as it was, counted for something. Diego, who now had a legitimate job overseeing vendor quality for Hearthline's riverfront contracts, stood in the workshop one evening and watched an assembly of workers tie finishes on upholstery like a small faith in motion. He had the steadiness his mother had taught him. He had expectations, a list, more than a bucket of memories. When Elliot called, sometimes his voice was cautious but present. They began to build a relationship mediated by meetings and sometimes by Sunday lunches, always one step at a time. Anna's final act in the public sequence was not a triumphant speech or an attempt to relish the reversal. Instead, she sat in front of a small crowd at a city meeting and described, in practical terms, the supplier equity program Hearthline had initiated. She spoke about dignity and procurement, and the way public projects can give small operators an opening without demanding they sell their souls. She did not mention Elliot by name. She did not need to. The present actions were evidence enough. When the city ribbon was cut for the riverfront restoration, a modest ceremony where speeches were polite and the crowd clapped in rhythms that felt rehearsed, Anna stood in the margin and watched the space she had worked for become a place people could use. Diego held the corner of the draping banner, his face steady. It was a scene of small victories and practical, earned outcomes. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Elliot watched too. He clapped as the ribbon fell, quiet and attentive. You might expect a tidy moral closure. A man repentant, a woman triumphant, a son relieved. Life rarely gives tidy closures. Instead, it gives ongoing work, the sort that requires returning to basics, contracts that require oversight, funds that require management, relationships that require repair. Anna had won something essential, the right to write, in practical terms, what would happen next. She had reclaimed dignity for herself and opened a path where others might not be dismissed so easily. In the quiet of her office that evening, she cleared an empty cup and set the brass key beneath the framed drawing. She looked at the drawing and then at the city lights in the distance. There was pride, yes, but also a weary satisfaction, the kind that comes after you have turned grief into governance and stubbornness into policy. Elliot, in his private room where photographs still lined the wall, sat with a small card that had been sent to him by Rachel. the attorney who had handled the legal work without relish. It said simply, "Accountability is not revenge." Perhaps he read it as advice, perhaps as admonishment. He began, finally, to understand the contours of a life he had once thought could be managed by image. The final scene is not cinematic in the way cameras like. It is domestic and political at once. Anna walked through Hearthline's workshop as looms hummed, stopped at the frame where Diego's drawing hung, and touched the brass key that had once been cold in her palm. She thought of Rain, and of the moment she had been forced out into it. She thought of the small decisions, refusing pity, learning to count margins, keeping a receipt, that had coalesced into a life capable of saying enough. Right then, a young apprentice came up to her holding a small sample of fabric. "We matched it to the riverfront," the apprentice said. "They loved the texture." Anna smiled and took the sample. "We'll deliver it on time," she said, "and we'll make sure the people who make it are treated like partners." The city at night can be a ledger of small lights, some bright, some dim. Anna's part in it was not to obliterate a man or to crown herself in flames. It was to ensure that the ledger balanced a bit more fairly than it had before. She had walked into a room where once she had been dismissed, and by patient and principled action, she had gained authority not to exact revenge, but to transform systems. If you take away anything from this, let it be this. Power can be built quietly from integrity and hard work, and justice is often the careful placement of facts until the only reasonable choice left is to be accountable. Anna did not break a man. She asked him to be responsible. He stumbled toward that responsibility in imperfect ways, but the record now included not only his failures but the structures enacted to reduce them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes that dignity should not be transactional. Tell us in the comments what you think Anna did right, and what you would have done differently.